So, all right. Good afternoon, everybody. Everyone in the virtual room right now knows me, but for those that don't and listen later, my name is Kai Teague. My pronouns are they, them. I identify as a two-spirit person, a trans person, a queer person. I am located in Poplar, Montana, in the Fort Pitt Res, where my family is. Um, I am also on my dad's side Mescalero Apache, and I am Irish on my mom's side. Um, so this is actually a really awesome, exciting podcast. Um, I did a whole lot of research, like a ton of research, for this podcast, and I have talked before in some capacities about like the history of two-spirit people, and I've kind of talked about more general like getting to know you terms and stuff like that, like introduction type stuff. But specifically, we're going to focus on like some historical things, and then also like kind of moving more towards right now, like different activism and movements, but focusing on some individuals, but broader narratives as well. Um, I will say that I'm going to make mistakes because I, again, did a lot of research for this, but there's a lot to learn. And of course, a majority of the things that I drew from came from historical text, from archivists. A lot of those archivists, especially going back, are colonizers. So there's a lot of language in there that is pretty grotesque. But even as we start to kind of like uncover and like reveal and learn more about ourselves in this space, we tended to and still to some degree might use inaccurate descriptions or languages or terms. So I apologize. And of course, when you get into the nuance of understanding um, tribal histories and indigenous histories, there's going to be inaccuracies in terms of like information that is available when you're learning about these things. And so what I share is only what I could glean from the information that I had. And so just remember that when you're learning about these things, not to necessarily be like, well, I know, because there's always more to learn, and sometimes you'll never know. Okay. And for whoever is present, if you do have questions, just let me know. You can unmute yourselves. I'm okay being interrupted to some degree. So just in terms of some of the language that I'm going to use, we specifically are talking about two-spirit people. And two-spirit is a direct translation. It's an Ojibwe term. It's Nish Manidueg. And it means two-spirited or two-spirit. And it specifically came about, it isn't, two-spirit is an English term. It emerged in the late 1989 at the third annual International Two-Spirit Gathering in Winnipeg. Hold on 1 minute. I don't know, let my cat out. Now everyone's happy. Um, so, and I'm going to talk more about that gathering, which again, I learned a whole lot more about when I was doing this research. But essentially, it is somebody that is kind of fulfilling many mixed gender roles found traditionally amongst Native and Indigenous peoples and Canadian First Nations peoples. So the mixed gender roles encompass both by term historically, including and wearing clothing and performing work associated with both men and women. I'm going to leave it on this slide while I talk about some historical context. And so I welcome you to kind of just read some of the captions that are here. I am going to reference some of these later in different ways, and we're going to go through and talk about some of these movements in history. But actually, hold on 1 second. I also just want to say hi to Leona because I see you on here. um, so in terms of the term LGBT or that acronym, it has been used since the 1980s, and it's changed a whole lot. Or it's changed several times, and there continue to be different iterations of that term. And actually, around 1988, it became LGBT as opposed to GLBT. And this is because even in our own community, of course, there are certain discriminations that are had towards one another. And specifically, the L was moved to the front, making space for women and specifically for lesbians. Um, there again are variants of that acronym. Were, and likely will always be because we're human tensions within our own LGBTQ community regarding inclusivity or exclusion with those terms, especially with regard to the trans community. Um, I always put the 2S first, which 2S is an abbreviation of Two Spirit. I I always put it at the beginning. Um, and so let me pause for a minute, actually. In this session, I am going to first talk about some history. And in that, I'm going to talk about language a little bit, and the context of where language comes from, how we get to the space of language, and communication. And then I'm going to talk kind of more about like the actual history, different people throughout that history, different movements. And so I am going to digress for a moment, and I'm going to talk about the movie Arrival, um, which I can't see anyone, so I can't see uh, if anyone has seen the film or if you have seen it or haven't seen it, especially if you haven't seen it and you want to see it. I'm sorry if I give anything away. But the movie Arrival is about aliens coming to Earth. There's 12 different alien crafts that arrive different locations all over the world. One of those is in Montana, actually. Um, to me, though, this movie is about our response as humans to their arrival. Um, and it's also about language and language being informed by thought processes, relationships, and language having the ability to shape your understanding of the world or reality, time, etc. And so in the movie, Louise, who is one of the main characters, is a linguist. And she goes up to kind of interpret, like, why are they here? What are they doing? Can we understand one another? And she begins speaking to the aliens. And at some point, she is, I guess you would say, dreaming, having visions to some degree of different moments. She doesn't know if they're the future, if they're the past, if they're dreams, what they are, but she's kind of like visualizing and having memories of something that she hasn't experienced, essentially. Um, she does come to find out. So again, this is where I'm kind of giving away some stuff. If you haven't seen it, she comes to find out that it is memories of the future. Um, she begins to dream in this language and all this kinds of stuff. But in the film, she says, if you learn it, like if you really learn that language, that you'll begin to perceive time differently. You'll begin to perceive time as the aliens do. So you can understand what is to come because time for them is nonlinear. So essentially, the language shapes those thoughts and connections in relationship to not just place, but time. And I have some qualms with this quote, but in the film, it also says language is the foundation of civilization, and it's the glue that holds people together. And it's also the first weapon drawn in conflict. The qualms I have with that are about it being the foundation for civilization and it being the glue that hold people together. It's not that I disagree, but I think that prior to language is relationship. Um, Language comes out of an understanding of relationship. to place, to people, to time, to lands. So the reason that I share this piece about language, that I share this example of how language can, I guess, language, and again, like how your brain can be developed differently based upon the language that you understand, because again, that is about relationship, that you can think in multiple ways, in a lot of different ways, and not just linearly. So if we think about that when we're going to talk about the history of Two-Spirit people and Indigenous people in general, then it helps us to think about all of the variances in terms of relationship to place, to one another, the relationship and understanding of our values and belief systems, and of course, how different that those are and can be. And then also that language can be used as a weapon, as a tool, as an instrument. And language is not just verbal, of course, it can be movement. It can be a vibe in some way, I guess I would say, but language can be also interpreted in many different ways. Communication is many things. So when we think about those terms, you take something, and is it a weapon? Is it a tool? Is it a gift? Is it an instrument? Based upon some of our how we understand relationship, it's going to inform how we think about those words, how we think about those terms, and are we weaponizing something? How are we using it? How are we thinking about it? And so the reason that I start with that is, again, thinking about relationship and kinship to someone, to something, to a place, a custom, a value, and language being the means of communicating about those things or about them. And so if we aren't thinking about relationship and communication styles when we talk about colonization and eradication of peoples, of Two-Spirit peoples, of Indigenous peoples in lands and their inhabitants, then we are going to have to do all that work over again. Like if you're not thinking about those things in terms of understanding that, to me, I essentially think that we're wasting time, because of it all goes back to that. It all goes back to relationship, kinship, understanding, and then the communication of those things. I'm gonna see how we're doing, if anyone has any comments or questions. We're good. If you, I'm not totally in control of this session, so if you do have kind of comments or questions or something, you might have to like raise your hand or do something like that. So again, I'm going to talk about some of these images a little bit later, but some of these are taken from different projects that are happening. And I'm going to talk about the project a little bit later for the first two images on the left side. And then I'm going to refer to some of the activism and movements that happened for the images that you see in the middle and on the right. And they're just really awesome, empowering images. So, so the one thing that I would have to say that is really exciting about this, and I have friends that are linguists, I have friends that are archivists. I am just a general nerdy researcher person that just likes to kind of dig into things and go down rabbit holes. And I comment on this later, but there were parts of doing this specific research that were very emotional, for many reasons. But part of it was because of actually, like 10 years ago, if you would have gone online and you would have looked for information about Two-Spirit people, it was very hard to find. You could really not find too much. You could find a YouTube video, and one of those reasons might be because of the language. We were not using the term two-spirit as much. It was there, but it just wasn't something that people were going by as much. It definitely wasn't trending. So that's part of the reason. Again, when you think about language, what is it that you're looking for? What are the terms that we're using to find that, or the questions that we're asking? But even within like that last 10 years to 5 years to even the last couple years, and honestly, I would say some of the strong anti-trans legislation that we're having, some of this like, negativity is also, I think, bringing about people to put more information out there. But it's really emotional because especially with two-spirit people, and traditional gender variant roles within our indigenous communities, like we are one of the first people to definitely be targeted during colonization. And not just in terms of like physical harm, but also erasure of references too. And so sometimes you're just like, that we were there, you hear that we were there, but you're like, you're not finding any proof, you're not finding any of those ancestors, you're not finding like any of that information that says in fact that we were. So excuse me. But so this was actually really exciting. And again, like, I mean, I've looked this stuff up a million times, but all of a sudden it's just like these virtual portals or doorways were opening up, and it was leading to me to all of these different spaces to like not just find historical documentation and information, but things that like moved through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s up until now. And I'm telling you, I'm sure there's other people out there that would say the information was there, and I'm sure it was, but it was not easy to find. So it's really exciting. It's really exciting to share this, and it's really exciting to be able to find that information. I am not going to attempt to pronounce all of the names of the people that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to look in the chat real quick. Oh, okay, cool. Because I don't want to mispronounce them, and some of them are not easy to find the how it sounds. So let me get myself up to speed really quick. I just said that I'm not going to say that, but I heard her name said several times, so I'm going to try it. And I think it's Biawacheshish, which translates to woman chief. And actually, she was born to a different tribe, to the Grovant people, but then she was kidnapped by the Crow people at the age of 10, or of course around the age of 10. And I will say that the depictions that you see here, that these images, that there's like contention around them in terms of like aligning stories with actual images of her when she was younger versus people knowing her as Biawacheshish when she was older. And so I'll just let you know that of course, like when you're looking at this type of information, that sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. And sometimes you have to find if it aligns or not, and you might never know. So the one thing that I want to note here, and there's a lot of stories and information actually about her specifically. She did engage like in the activities of men. So for the most part, like a lot of the work that she did, and I'm referring to her as she because she's still dressed as a woman, and from what I can understand, didn't go as anything else. I know that there is a term in Crow, which is this, it's BATE, and there's an inflection over the E, which you obviously don't see here, but I don't know how to pronounce the word. If anyone here does, please let me know. But she's still dressed as a woman. But in terms of like everything that she did in her life, she performed as a man. Everything that I've heard about her, read about her, she was very well known for leading war parties, for also negotiations. And this is something that I'll share in all of the stories that I could find. there was always a piece in there about negotiations, about two-spirit people being good negotiators, being moving between and communicating, not just between like men and women, but amongst different tribes and different political parties. So she was one of the third highest ranking chiefs at the council of that time. Typically, from what I know and from what is said, that women did not become chiefs. And so some of that is you can see reflected in her name. She did have multiple wives. She was eventually actually killed by the Grovant people. I think that she had been trying to make some communications, but she was also really well known for battle and for killing people, specifically Grovant people. So at some point in the negotiations and the communications that they were having, she was killed by her own people. My understanding is once they recognized like who she was. So I'm using notes, so I want to kind of get caught up. One of the things that I will share here, though, is that when we're talking about some of this stuff, like the language that we use now, two spirits, feminine, and things like that, like gender and sexuality, those terms did not exist. We did not use those kind of terms. So even now, like we're kind of projecting onto them our interpretation of that performance or that function or that thing that they're doing, or the way that they were. And of course, we can't totally know everything about like how these people identified. There is a term that I will share that is used quite often when you're doing this research, and that's Berdash. Berdash is originally a Persian term, and it means like a kept boy or like a sex slave, essentially. And so whenever Spaniards specifically originally like came to indigenous lands over here, like in Turtle Island and then in South America, a lot of the things that they were seeing in terms of like gender performance and different people's roles and the way what they perceived as like male and female, they were not comfortable with, is a really, really nice way to put that. And so that is the term that they applied to people that they saw that did not match like gender performance or same-sex couples, or heterosexual couples. So that term was used for a very long time. Still, sometimes you will see people using it, even indigenous people, like when we're referring to ourselves like in the 80s and 90s. It's a very inappropriate term to use. And one of the things that I'll say about that is that there is reference to, and I'm specifically going to share this book actually real quick. This is a really awesome book. It's Reclaiming Two Spirits, Sexuality, Spiritual Renewal, and Sovereignty in Native America. Dr. Gregory Smithers is not an Indigenous person. He is from New Zealand, but worked with Indigenous people for like over 20 years, I think, to put this text together. And so there's some really good information in there and a lot of really intentional thought around language. But one of the things that I will say is that in terms of some of the things that he mentioned in there, in terms of archivists and stuff like that, again, which is that there were euphemisms. And so a lot of people historically with regard to kinships roles, they didn't understand, or sorry, many historians specifically with regard to kinship roles, they didn't understand regarding gender and sexuality of Native people. So they would take euphemisms about us, something like sodomite or berdash, and then they would perpetuate it. And they would kind of continue to use that language when they talked about us. So like effeminate men. So that's kind of like where that language just gets drawn out and taken into these other places. The other thing that I want to mention when we think about these things is that there were specific intentions for various artists that were doing depictions like this, and historians and archivists that did not want to record this information. they essentially wanted to erase the mention of like indigenous Two-Spirit people, Wink Day people, so that knowledge or references and education about us were not passed down and were not discussed. And so it's sometimes when we think that information isn't there, it's not always because of we didn't exist. There's intention. There's more to look at there. Do we have any questions or comments so far? Not yet. Okay. Anytime anybody wants to jump in, I'm totally happy to, for whatever random questions. So, oh heck, I better get through this more quickly. So Osh-Tish was Crow also, and performed primarily as a woman. And it's interesting because of when I learned about Osh-Tish, while they typically performed as a woman and dressed as a woman in their community, when they went to battle, they dressed as a man. And of course, this is an interpretation, but it was largely because of when in battle, they didn't want to be found out, essentially, is what it sounded like. They didn't want to be outed, I guess, in that space. But again, what I want to share here about some of these people is that what their roles were. And these are things that we hear generalizations about. And in some ways, we are only going to hear generalizations, but they tended to excel in a lot of the spaces that they put their energies into. They did tend to move back and forth between men's and women's roles. And again, became negotiators between the tribes, and even within their own communities. And so my apologies for kind of jumping through some of these. Hashtin Kla, I specifically asked one of my friends about the pronunciation of this name. Hashtin Kla is Dene. They're a Nadle person. And Nadle, sometimes you will see it described as an effeminate man, but again, I think that might be a projection of the kind of language that was being used. It also, and I think this is probably more appropriate, but again, I would have to ask, is a changing person or one who transforms. But I will say that amongst the Dene people that there are multiple genders. And so it could be something that is like an effeminate man or a man performing as a woman. And there are other terms for women that performed as men. Some of the images that you see here are weavings that Hashtin Kla did. And there is some tension around some of these because traditionally they did sand paintings as well. And sand paintings are not meant to be permanent depictions, which they were kind of trying to record some of this information. And so did these weavings. But they did perform both in traditionally male roles and female roles, and were definitely considered a medicine person in their community. There's a really, really, really amazing information specifically about Hashtin Kla and their relationships to these weavings and deciding to put them in more permanent forms. That it seems like there was like a lot of intention in terms of their thought about being able to do that and the reasons why you shouldn't do it and how they did it. And I have links to all of the stuff that I researched that I'm happy to share with everyone. So Wewa is Zuni, and someone that we often see when we're talking about Two-Spirit people. There are books written about Wewa. And one of the things that I want to point out here is Wewa was orphaned as an infant, and apparently the adopted family was kind of wealthy and influential amongst the Zuni people. And sometimes I kind of am wondering now if that might be why there's more information about them. It did change their position and status and ability to travel. And so sometimes when there's others, we don't have as much information about them. And I wonder if part of it is that status. That is totally me, like imposing my questions upon like that situation. The other thing I want to point out here is of course, there are like the notes about Weiwa that as early as 3, she was recognized as being like a two-spirit person, which this term that you see, Ahimana, which I do not know if I'm pronouncing right, is the Zuni term for two-spirit people. But as early as like the age of 3 or 4, they were identified in this way. And so I want to say, you know, like, especially now, like when we talk about two-spirit people and trans people and LGBT people, people tend to say like we're trending, that we decided at a much later age. People talk about that influence on children. But when you talk to people that are older, and even again, looking back at these historical counts, like people have always known. We have always known, our families have always known. There were things about us that are identifiable, whether it's the things that we're interested in, the ways that we perform, the roles that we play. So I just want to make note of that. And of course, we can see that pattern or that consistency over time. The one thing I want to point out about Weiwa, she is really well renowned for being a negotiator again for the Zuni people. She traveled to Washington, D.C. and met with President Grover Cleveland at the time, and was advocating for various needs for the Zuni people. And I want to say that, you know, a lot of times you'll hear that visibility is a double-edged sword. And so there was a lot of attention around her visit at that time. And actually, she was perceived as a cisgendered woman. A lot of people in that space perceived her as a cisgendered woman. And so it wasn't about the fact that she was two-spirit. But then on the following end of her trip, the U.S. Office of Indian Affairs, through the policy of assimilation, began enacting policies specifically to dismantle cultural practices and pressure the tribe to leave behind the acknowledgement and inclusivity of Ahimana people. So again, it's one thing for people to see us and learn about us, but then it does bring about more negative attention sometimes. So I'm definitely jumping forward in terms of a timeline, but this part is really, really exciting to me. And this is some of the new information that I learned, which a lot of times we hear about the coining of the term two-spirit. We hear about that it happened in Winnipeg in 1989. But in terms of the origins of those community members and relatives that did a lot of that work building up into that time, we don't tend to hear as much. So this book, Living the Spirit, is an anthology. I will say that it was compiled by Will Roscoe, which Will Roscoe is not a Native person. And excuse me, there's varying opinions in terms of like Will Roscoe's interactions and engagements with Indigenous communities. But it seems like in this space specifically, they supported like a really, really awesome compilation of work. So the people that you see here are Randy Burns, who is Northern Paiute, and Barbara May Cameron, who is Hunkpapa Lakota. And I don't know if any of you remember, but Barbara May Cameron was actually highlighted on like Google and those little depictions that they have, I think within this last year, which was pretty awesome. So both of them did grow up on their respective reservations and then moved to San Francisco later on in their lives. They co-founded the acronym, I guess, depending on how you say it, is GAY, Gay American Indians. And of course, at that time, when we think about terminology, it was primarily like gay and lesbian. There were not a lot of other terms being used. And so during that time, I think both of them were going to school at the university, but all of this work that they were doing was very grassroots. It was like completely community oriented. They saw needs. They saw, I guess, a need, especially for urban Indians and gay Native Americans at that time to need to come together and provide some support. So there's some other information that I have here, but I wonder if maybe like I probably need to go to the next slide for it. But these are some of the founders of that movement. There's some of the people that were there, like I guess on the ground level doing that work. They engaged in a ton of different things. So yes, there was just like creating supportive spaces, but they also did start doing like archival work and recording histories and stories of people to put something together to show that like they were in fact there, that we did have a history, that we did have experiences that people needed to hear about and see. And so this is just more information about them. I do want to point out this image on the bottom right, which is the Twin Peaks bar in San Francisco. There's a really awesome recording actually from Randy Burns that is more recent. And so he's an elder at this point, and there's a couple different recordings. And he's really going through and explaining like what that time was like, what that experience like. Some of it is a little bit harsh to listen to, but it's like, it's really awesome. I just sat and listened to it, and it just felt like I was getting to hear from like one of my relatives that I could share an experience with in that space of being like LGBTQ and two-spirit, and hearing about like the unidealized lifestyles that we can end up leading or living to get to spaces of advocacy. But one of the things that they pointed out was that at that time, historically, queer people in general, but definitely also two-spirit people and indigenous LGBTQ native people, safe spaces were bars. There were not community spaces, community organized spaces, there were bars. And especially in the Castro district, a lot of those bars, and I would say probably on the East Coast as well, were white males. They were gay white males. They didn't allow women in, they didn't allow people of color in. There was a lot of discrimination within the community. Yes, well, if you weren't a white man. But one of the first meetings where they decided that we're going to do this thing took place in the Twin Peaks bar. And I just like this quote where he's saying that we're going to turn double oppression into double opportunity. And that's a good way to turn things, and say, yeah, like we're going to take these things that are harsh and we're going to like put all of them together and create something with them. And I want to mention here that you see this picture of Reverend Jesse Jackson with Barbara May Cameron. She was actually put on a panel, like a coalition for the National Rainbow Coalition, which was part of Jesse Jackson's when he was running for president in '84. And that actually, the Rainbow Campaign was about facing different forms of discrimination in different communities. And that term actually came from Fred Hampton, who was a Black Panther. And so it's just really interesting to see like all of these intersections of discrimination and oppression, and then the things that can come from them. So this is where we're getting closer to the creation of the term two-spirit. People are starting to gather, people are starting to organize at this time. Some of this is definitely coming out of the AIM movement. So you have the AIM movement happening, and then you have like, and this is of course like in the 70s and then early 80s, and then you have gay American Indians who are also trying to organize and create space for themselves. You see this t-shirt here that says the basket and the bow, and actually I think in one of the interviews, Randy, he talks about the basket and the bow ceremony, which is like a coming of age ceremony for Paiute people in terms of like, which way are you going to live your life? And so again, when we think about gender and sexuality and orientation, there are ceremonies that where people would choose. And a lot of times, I mean, I guess I'm generalizing here, but it was a choice in some way. I guess it was who you were, but also you were given that autonomy to participate in life how you are. And hopefully what would happen is that your family and your community and your tribe would respond to that and would make sure that you had what you needed in those spaces to exist in that way. So at the same time, the AIDS epidemic, the HIV/AIDS epidemic was also happening. A lot of people at this time will talk to you about or will share their experience of losing a lot of relatives in this space. And I want to point out here that I have watched a lot of documentaries and listened to a lot of interviews and podcasts and read a lot of things about the LGBTQ movement in general, and Two-Spirit people in general, trans people in general. And in all of those things, I was thinking about it when I was putting this together. You never, ever, ever see all the Netflix documentaries, all the documentaries everywhere. You don't see Native people and Indigenous people in those spaces. You don't see any of these pictures, any of these images, any of these references in those stories. So this was another reason that it was really exciting to find just these pictures, just like a picture to see that like our relatives were there, they were doing this work, they were participating in this way. They got us to where we are, to where we're having this kind of conversation right now, to where we're able to engage in the kind of activism that we can right now. So, and again, I have a lot of information, a lot more information than this, and a lot of links that I'm happy to share with people regarding these gatherings. So we're getting like into the late into like 1990, and then moving into the like 2000. So the building that you see here is the American Indian Community House, which was founded in 1969. And then there's Wewa and I'm not sure how you Bar Chiamp, which is a different interpretation or a different way of referring actually back to Biwasheshish. So this was a building that was established in 1969, but then this other kind of thing grew out of it, which was developed in 1989. And then out of that grew this publication that you see here called Buffalo Hide, which kind of came later in like the latter part of the 80s and early 90s. And this was like a collaboration of people like publishing and disseminating information about Two-Spirit people and Indigenous people in the LGBTQ sphere. They are no longer active. And the one thing that I want to point out here is that this kind of activism, again, is like extremely grassroots. And so a majority of the things that were funded in this space did not come from grants. They came from people in the street donating, community members donating, performances that they would do to generate income. And so granted, a lot of these things are not still around because of it came from the community. And I'm going to try and wrap up just to leave a little bit of time. But fast forward, these images that you see here, the one that says decolonize this museum and demilitarize our art, people over profit, this comes specifically from 2019, and I think it was let me get my notes straight real quick. Got too many notes. It was from the Whitney Museum in 2019. There was a march there. The Whitney was honoring Indigenous people, and this came specifically from an article that I read related to this march and this gathering. A recent example: during the opening reception of 2019 Whitney Biennial, Indigenous Women's Collective co-founders De Loggins and Maria Hupfield, who is Anishinaabe, unfurled a banner reading "Demilitarize our art, people over profit." The activists then read a statement calling upon the Whitney to remove Warren Kanders from the museum board of directors. Kanders owned a company at the time that produced tear gas canisters, which were used against protesters at Standing Rock and at the U.S. border. So as Hupfield noted afterwards, it was just really rough to see a lot of Native artists being included in the biennial, while at the same time, the board member was basically targeting our communities. After several months of protests and similar protests, Kanders did step down. But I just want to show, that this is the kind of work and the kind of activism and the kind of movements that it does take, that it does require, to call people out, and is also the power of Two-Spirit people coming together. So now this is like present day, very recent past. Again, like I said, when we look at what kind of information was available, what kind of groups and organizations were around, honestly, even within the last couple of years, like I said, the consistency of like online access to this information, it was like very inconsistent. But now, like the Montana Two Spirit Society, they have been around for a really long time. I think since 96. This is a image from 2023. You have people like Candy Brinksplenny, who was rallying in 2017 while No DAPL was happening. This is specifically a Two-Spirit rally protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. You have Bates, which is the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirit Society. I think they've had powwows in that area for about 13th annual. So they're coming up on their 13th annual powwow. And then I wanted to share this, but let me see if I can, I don't know if I can drop the link. I'll share it later with everyone. This multimedia project for this image that you see right here referencing Waikiki Beach and the Mahu, this is a pretty new project. I had actually been following their cultural leader for quite a long time, and there's a documentary called Kumuhina on YouTube that you can find about her. But it's interesting to watch that documentary and then now see this project happening, which actually goes to tell the story of some origin stories of the Mahu, which are two-spirited people, essentially. And it's like this really rich animated film that they do that's really only like 10 minutes, but really powerful. So again, it's really awesome to just like see this evolution happening in our communities. This is an actual event that's coming up. So Bates, which I mentioned just a moment ago, if you go to Eventbrite, if you go to this link, or you type in like, www.bateseventbrite.com, they have talking circles, Two-Spirit talking circles that you can join online. I want to give a shout out to Alfred Walkingpool, who is on Fresh Fruit. This you can go and listen to like every Thursday. They have really fun conversations, talk about popular culture a lot, and highlight different music and indigenous artists quite a bit. These images, again, come from different artists, looking at Two-Spirit and gender variant people all over the world. This is an artist event that Bates hosted, which is like they host different like artist workshops and pop-up shops and stuff like that. And these last these two slides are literally just people that I follow and am aware of. And so I know that there's 20 million more out there. And the reason that I specifically want to share these is because when we think about the first slides, and we think about the few stories, the few like transcestors, if you will, that we had to learn about, the information and the way that they were characterized a lot of times from archivists. And then you think about now, and you look at like all of these different people, all these different movements, all these different artists. It's like amazing. Like sitting down doing this was a really actually amazing experience to be able to see that. These are just a couple different artists that I follow. Cayman, I actually met through my friend Hannah. Cayman is a filmmaker and a really awesome person. These are other people that you can follow, books that you can read. They're all different. They're artists, they're actors, they're writers, they're doctors, they're there's just like so many different capacities in which our relatives, our two-spirit relatives, exist in. And so with that, I just want to say thank you. I'm going to stop sharing. If you want to put your camera on, if you want to say anything, we have a few minutes. So I guess I'll say thank you, Wopida, to FPCC and to everyone for joining. But yeah, any questions or comments or anything anyone wants to share? I'm just going to sit here until you do.
I just want to say thank you for sharing all this. It's really nice to see all this.
Thank you. I guess I will say really quickly, hi, Aaron. Hi, Aaron and Leona. I'm not sure how you're listening, if you're like able to like be on screen or anything, but it's nice. It's nice to have you both here. I worked with both of them at the American Indian College Fund and deeply miss them. So great you joined.
Okay. Diane
Um,
Echanu, you did really well, and I'm proud of you. I like all the research that you did to put this together. It's really awesome to see how far you're coming along with everything that you're learning and what you're highlighting too. That's awesome. And I was thinking like some of the historic information that you were presenting, like doing a lot of the historic Dakota research, like in Minnesota, like there's not a lot, even recognition of women, there's not a lot. It's like really focused on men. And I think you mentioned something about like information missing or there being gaps, but what was coming to mind was like there's all these records about how they were trying to shift and establish gender roles. Like they set up a whole Dakota community just to like restructure gender roles, and it failed horribly. But like there's records like that too that I think might reveal some of those gaps too. It's like, well, they're creating this, but what are they opposing or what are they fighting? So yeah, and then I appreciate your intro with arrival too. Just saying.
I knew it. I knew. So actually, I appreciate you saying that, Aaron. And there's like a ton of notes that I had that when you actually start talking about this, you can get overwhelmed and derailed. But that was so the book that I mentioned at the beginning, that was some of the stuff that I was really paying attention to. And the way that they, a lot of times they'll focus on like the destruction or harm amongst two-spirit people or Winkte people or Nothlai people. But actually at the same time, like I was thinking a lot about the arrival of colonists, and looking at like what the gender performance of a man looked like. And in this book, they're talking about the descriptions of a lot of especially Spaniard colonists in the text I read, talking about how effeminate the men were in terms of their attire and their dress and how they acted. And so at the same time that they're targeting us, they're also targeting men and kind of like demasculinizing them. And the other thing I thought about was there's almost no real mention of women. Like there's no real actual like conversation about women, which I also thought was interesting because it's just like they're just overlooking them. There's just like no real focus on who women were, what they liked, what they, not saying what they did in terms of their roles, but like there was a lot of focus on men, even in those spaces. And so I don't know, it's just it's really interesting to read and then think about. And then I ventured further to think about some of the way that men are now. And this is something that I'm going to say is like does not reflect, none of this reflects like Fort Peck Community College. These are my thoughts. But thinking about what colonists were trying to impose in terms of the performance of men on Indigenous people, and like this overcompensation of men, like how men today act. And in a way, it is like a continuation of that overperformance of being a man in order to like assert this dominance or to not be questioned in terms of like their masculinity. So it's really interesting, and I completely think that these conversations should be happening in a lot of other places outside of just like the queer community and in like Native American studies and all these other spaces, because this is a very decolonial conversation to me.
Will you be able to share the slides and the links?
Yes, I definitely will. And actually, I think I know how to get a hold of pretty much everyone here, so I can share them out with you, definitely. And I think if that's it, if anyone has any questions or comments, we're a few minutes over time, so I don't want to run too long, push people out.
I actually just had a couple questions. Thanks so much. Like that was like a ton of research. And I can tell that you had like a lot more to share, and it was probably hard to try to find a concise way of like making that timeline work. Some of that I definitely didn't know. But I think, when you're talking about how there's a lot, not a lot of stuff coming out about like kind of the birth of the Two-Spirit movement, and it's a hard time finding pictures and stuff like that. I just wonder what's being done to like make sure that that's documented, because I feel like that's we're a generation maybe past that, but it just seems like that's probably like all of the pictures and all the stories and whatnot are held with people right now, and you don't want to let that go and kind of lose it. So I was wondering if you knew of any like efforts for like documenting, today, I guess, in the recent past.
I'm not super familiar. I would have to say that this book, Renewing Two Spirits or Reclaiming Two Spirits, is probably one of the most recent things that I've seen that is kind of trying to document some stories. And I have to be honest, I have not made it through the entire thing because there's so much information. But it's still not documenting it in the same way, and especially like those images and I wouldn't say it's totally academic. It is somewhat accessible, but like I'm not aware of it. I'm not sure if like if Aaron, if you're aware of anything in that space, but like that's the other thing that I thought about was that we went through this, you go through this process of this information being from the grassroots, from the community, and then it gets into this academic space of people doing research and recording information, but it primarily staying in an academic space. And then now it going back out into community engagement and community efforts again. And so it's interesting to like see that and look at it and how it's happening. So that's like a long answer to say that no, I'm not aware of something like that. It was like it's piecemeal. I would say if something like that does happen, that I love the access that academics have, but I would hope that it was done in a way that it was accessible to our community members.
Mhm.
And then it didn't get held in that space, or get held up, I guess, in that space.
Yeah.
I think the only other question I had is, so I saw on the flyer that this was kind of going to be a history one, but I was wondering what comes next for the podcast.
Yes, I actually I should know that. I should know what comes next for the podcast, and I'm not totally positive. I have like a list, a pretty comprehensive list of conversations and topics that I have proposed and want to have. And actually, I think I can probably tell you. Godzilla. So that was like me looking at what my list is and then getting a message about Godzilla. I will say that I have always wanted to have a conversation about Godzilla in this space because historically Godzilla was gender neutral.
Mhm.
But then through the films and movies being moved like to America and American production, they felt a need to identify Godzilla's gender. So
When I start my podcast, I'll have you on and we can talk about that for like 3 hours.
that's exciting. Aaron will invite you. So one of the conversations that I'm not sure if I would have next, because I would like to have enough time to bring some other voices into the space, is about current policy and legislation. Specifically, I mean, we're in Montana. I think Montana is a great state to point out some of the examples of like how harsh some of that is. And then we also have the Montana Two-Spirit Society. And so I would hope to kind of create some more relationships before having that one. And then also like how to create space in your community and engage civically are some of the conversations that we want to have. Like, how do we advocate for ourselves on a personal level, but then also on a community level, but then also moving up towards like to the tribes, to the state. So kind of like, how do we do something with what we have? How do we do something with what we know or understand? How do we come together, especially in a very virtual age? And I do want to talk, as Aaron mentioned, about the intersections of violence against Two-Spirit people, women, and land. So there's like a million different conversations that I would like to have, but I think that we will have one coming up in 2 weeks, and I will have to settle on a topic for that. So
So is every 2 weeks kind of like your goal for having a new one?
that's the goal, every 2 weeks.
Sweet.
And then really quickly, if someone does watch this, or for people that are on, we are tomorrow evening having a documentary discussion night at Greet the Dawn from 5:30 to 7:30. The film is only 1 hour long. It's for the documentary Two Spirits. If you are coming, if you're planning to come, if you're planning to bring any younger people, just content warnings that there is reference to like someone being harmed, the death, and there are some descriptions of the way that the person was harmed. And so we just want people to know if they're going to attend. Yeah, I think that's it. If anyone ever wants to join a podcast in the future just to sit around and throw out other questions and conversation, I think that that is a very exciting space to exist in, and where really fun conversations can be had. So I think if that's it, I will say thank you very much to everyone, and yeah, see you next time.
Thank you. Okay.